In today's basic world religions video, we're going to talk a little bit about Judaism. Before we talk about it, we really need to differentiate Judaism from a lot of the other religions we've discussed so far this semester. Judaism is a monotheistic religion. A lot of the other religions we've discussed are polytheistic or pantheistic or monistic. Monotheism means that there is one God, and literally that it's a personal deity. That's really the major difference between Judaism and something like the concept of Brahman in Hinduism. As in Hinduism, Brahman is the one ultimate reality of the universe, but not really personal. You know, it's the kind of the stuff that everything participates in, but it doesn't have an identity in and of itself. In Judaism, the God is a single God, but is also a personal God. It's a God that exists in relationship to humanity and has an existence apart from humanity and apart from the world. So that's the major difference between a lot of the Eastern religions that we've been looking at and a lot of the Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that we will be looking at over the course of the next few weeks. Judaism is intensely monotheistic. In fact, I think that's the defining factor for Judaism. The core Jewish prayer is something called the Shema, which comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And the Shema says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord alone." Literally in the translation, it's, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." That's a pretty... We don't think of it as a really major statement today because we live in a monotheistic society. But back in the 9th century BCE, this would have been a major statement. Most of the religions at the time and most of the religions that the Jewish people dealt with regularly were polytheistic religions. The religion that the Jewish patriarch Abraham came out of was polytheistic. And so for Abraham to go from this polytheism to a belief in Yahweh as the one and only God is a really, really big step for religion. I want to talk a little bit about some of the early history of Judaism, talk a little bit about the Jewish patriarchs and the way that they looked at their relationship with God. And then we're going to spend a bit of time on Jewish practice. Judaism traces its history back, frankly, to the beginning of time. The core of the Jewish scriptures is something called the Torah. The Torah is pretty much the same as the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament. So if you're familiar with Christianity, you're probably already familiar with most of the stories from the Torah. Now, those books have been a part of Jewish scripture much longer than they've been a part of Christian scripture. Christianity is one of those strange religions that kind of steals from other people's scriptures. And so the Torah is really, it's the cornerstone of Jewish faith. And it begins with God's creation of humanity in a state of perpetual paradise and bliss. But through disobedience and through sin, humanity falls from that grace and is expelled from paradise. This is kind of a central Judeo-Christian idea that somehow as human beings we're called to be in relationship with God, but at the same time we've fallen away from that perfect relationship in some way. And so the big question for Judaism and Christianity is, how do we bring ourselves back to that perfect sense of relationship? The story in the Jewish scriptures is a story of the Jews' kind of ongoing relationship with Yahweh, with their God. If you read the book of Genesis, the first half a dozen chapters of the book of Genesis is a series of stories about fall, about the people's fall from grace. And then Yahweh's, still, even though they've fallen from grace, wishing to be in community and communion with them. The story in Genesis really starts to, it really hits its stride once we get to the story of Abraham. And Abraham is considered the patriarch of all 3 of the great monotheistic religious traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Abraham was born in Ur in Babylon, which is in present-day Iraq. And he was very likely a polytheist. He worshipped the Babylonian gods. He took part in the Babylonian rituals, which basically had to do with this, with commemorating the creation of the world through a war between a younger generation of gods led by the god Marduk against an older generation of gods symbolized by the being Tiamat. Marduk ultimately destroys Tiamat and creates the heavens and the earth, and this is celebrated every year at the New Year's festival in Babylon. Yahweh was a kind of a minor deity in the Middle East at the time. Yahweh was a deity that was associated with armies. It was literally Yahweh Sabaoth. And so Abraham receives a vision at one point in his life where he's asked to basically go where Yahweh is asking him to go and to worship Yahweh alone among all the other gods. Now, notice at this point, Abraham isn't asked to worship Yahweh as the only God. He's not monotheistic yet. He's asked to worship Yahweh alone. He still believes that Baal and El and Marduk and all the other gods in the Canaanite and the Babylonian pantheon exist, but his worship is for Yahweh. A bit of a background on polytheistic religion. You might have noticed, if you know anything about Middle Eastern religion, that we're kind of conflating a couple of different pantheons here. On the one hand, you've got the Babylonian pantheon with Marduk and Tiamat and Ea and all those Babylonian gods, and then you've got the Canaanite pantheon with El and Baal and all of the gods that you tend to hear about throughout the Jewish scriptures. Basically what happens in Judaism is, frankly, in most polytheistic religions, is that each society, each culture has their own sets of gods. And when you're a part of that society, the expectation is that you'll start to worship those gods. So when Abraham was in Ur, he was very likely worshiping the Babylonian gods. When he moves into Canaan, basically the Canaanite gods, Baal and El and Asherah and a few others, are the gods that are the ones that he would have likely worshipped. Or that the people around him would have likely been worshiping, because he was a monotheist at the time. So Abraham is asked to worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone. This is absolutely key. This is the first time in history that we know of where we have a kind of an intense monotheism, where one God is believed to be good enough, as good as worshiping dozens of different gods for different things. Yahweh is a God of armies, but eventually his significance broadens and he becomes the one God of Israel. He basically is in covenant with Abraham. Yahweh makes an agreement with Abraham, and he tells Abraham that if Abraham worships him and him alone, that Yahweh will make Abraham's descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. This is interesting for Abraham because Abraham doesn't have any descendants. He is married, but his wife is old, and she's barren. She's unable to have children. And so it's kind of funny to him that Yahweh would say his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But because of his faith, according to the stories in Genesis, Yahweh gives Abraham a son, Isaac. And Isaac becomes the kind of the patriarch of Judaism. Little minor historical caveat here. Abraham actually has two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Before God gives Abraham and his wife Isaac, Abraham has sex with his concubine, Hagar, and they have a son by the name of Ishmael. Because Abraham wants someone to carry his line because Sarah is barren. So Sarah gives him permission to have sex with Hagar and to have this other son, Ishmael, that carries the line. once God gives Sarah and Abraham the son Isaac, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness. It's interesting because Judaism claims its descent from Isaac, while Islam claims its descent from Ishmael. And so you've got these two strands of that Abrahamic story, Judaism going in one direction with the history of Isaac and his family, and Islam going in the other direction with the history of Ishmael. That's how Jews and Arabs will kind of explain that they're both coming from Semitic, using Semitic languages, and that they're kind of connected through language and a lot of religious belief, because they both trace their ancestry back to Abraham. Now comes the really interesting part of the story. God gives Abraham this son, Isaac, and then when Isaac is a young boy, God basically takes Isaac away.